I'm Eric Cubic, Director of Programming for the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, and welcome to the final part of this Give Peace a Chance series with Dr. Frederic Pearson. Dr. Frederic Pearson runs our sister council in Detroit, and he's been a long-time supporter and colleague for our council, so we're thrilled to have him here tonight on our side of the state, where apparently it's much, much colder. So. I also want to thank the Kent District Library, our co-sponsors for the series, and especially to acknowledge Cascade Branch Library's staff, as well as Diane Cutler, who's standing in the back. Thank you so much for being such a great venue for this program. It's been lovely having you host the series
so much.
here.
It's been a pleasure.
Also, thank you to Aquinas College, who is here supporting our program tonight as well. Aquinas College is an educational partner of the Council for Western Michigan, and they help us further our mission of educating Western Michigan about global issues. Here with us tonight is Dr. Roger Durham. You can stand up. He's the chair of the Political Sciences program at Aquinas College, so he's doing a lot to educate this community on his own, but also helps us educate the community. Now, let me introduce Michelle Fox, the Director of Innovation and User Experience from the Kent District Library, who will be introducing our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the Cascade branch. We are so happy that you took time out of your busy lives to come be with us this evening and to hear our speaker. We have looked forward to putting this series on that has focused on peace building and international conflict resolution. So that's been an important thing for our library. As a library, we feel it's important to provide a welcoming space to explore new ideas and topics. This is part of our library's mission to give access to information, offer a world of ideas, and invite excitement into our communities. Partnering with the World Affairs Council has allowed us to bring you amazing speakers and give you that access to information and ideas in a forum that is open to all. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Frederic S. Pearson, is a native from Detroit who spent 20 years teaching at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. He is now the director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at Wayne State University. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan, having done his undergraduate work at Oakland University. He is a recognized authority in the fields of international military intervention, arms transfer effects on wars, and civil and international conflict analysis. He has twice been senior Fulbright research professor in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, having written on arms trade and crisis behavior in both countries. We hope you enjoyed tonight's speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pearson.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be back at the World Affairs Council and in Grand Rapids and this fine venue. And Roger will testify that, as mentioned, people sitting in the front row is unheard of for us, because when we teach, nobody sits in the front row. Everybody sits in the back, ready to lead. It's very exciting for me to be back, and also to have to sort of take stock of 100 days of a new administration and the potential implications for peace. Many of you may have heard from my colleague George Lopez last time in the series, and our colleagues from the U.S. Institute of Peace who came first to kick it off. So it's been a very, I'm sure, a good experience for those of you who had been able to hear the other two presentations. And I want to sort of anchor it tonight and get your reactions and your responses to what you perceive to be the peace prospects as they develop for the new administration. You know, new administrations usually come in with some carryover from past issues, but some break as well. And it's a standard sort of proposition that new administrations have carryover and reversal. If you think of President Obama, for instance, he came in determined to end two very unpopular wars, which he had inherited from his predecessor. But ironically, things don't always work out exactly as you plan and your new initiatives. And at the end of his term, we still had involvements in those same places, and indeed military engagement still going on with Iraq and Afghanistan. He also won a Nobel Peace Prize when he entered office, which was kind of remarkable. He said he didn't know why he won it exactly. And I think it may have been for his emphasis on nuclear weapons. His emphasis on doing something about nuclear weapons. Because he really did take that seriously as an issue and pursued it. Testament to that, I think, is the Iran nuclear agreement. A hard one and over a number of years. But again, ironically, at the end, he ended up with a budget that was much higher than any previous one as far as redeveloping our nuclear weapons. Because people had convinced him that somehow they had to be modernized and safeguarded, but also, and this is a little touchy, potentially made more usable in some way, shape, or form. So again, yes, change, but yes, continuity as well, and sort of what goes around comes around to some extent with new administrations. He also had an outreach to the Islamic world, which he wanted to make and probably try to repair and improve American Islamic relations around the world. And then again, of course, he ended up fighting terror issues and conducting military operations against Islamic groups in some parts of the Middle East. So again, a mixture in this sense. And I guess you'd have to say that we've seen a little bit of reversal and change of course already from the new administration in some respects. The difference may be that the emphasis starting out was quite different with the new administration, as far as how they would pursue, or how they proposed to pursue relations with the rest of the world, and presumably peacemaking in some respects. So President Trump took over with a very ringing statement in the inaugural address that had to do with what he called America First. And this, of course, rang a few bells for us older folks who had been around a while and knew and remembered that this is not the first time in our history that people have come up with a movement about America Firstism, so to speak. The other time, of course, was the 1930s, the period between the world wars, when America First had some interesting and some alarming connotations. It was a response to bitter experience of World War I, a desire not to engage in another foreign major war, and indeed that's understandable because that war was a little hard to explain to anybody, World War I, and why it had become so bloody and so long-lasting. So there was a backlash away from that. But at the same time, parts of the movement of America Firstism, as it was sort of termed, had a kind of an ugly connotation, too, at the time, which had to do with a certain tolerance for authoritarianism, a certain willingness to let that happen in the world. If you think of people like Charles Lindbergh, for instance, the noted heroic pilot, and maybe even extending to Joseph Kennedy in his ambassadorship in London, there was a certain tolerance of fascism, a certain desire to make deals with fascism, and that might be a decent thing. There was an undertone in my own city of anti-Semitism that went along with that. The famous Father Coughlin of Royal Oak, who was the radio priest and advocate of America Firstism, and I think connotations of anti-Jewish connotations and anti-foreign connotations. There was a building of tariff walls, the word wall. There was building of walls, so to speak, to make America immune to some of the things supposedly that were happening in the world. So there are a few disconcerting overtones when you bring up that theme again to highlight your approach to foreign policy, and it has implications about peace and the potential for peace. Now, I think we've seen a decided shift with the Trump administration about, if we will, about how peace is pursued. In a sense, I think back to Theodore Roosevelt's admonition of speak softly and carry a big stick. The big stick diplomacy was presumably the theme of the Teddy Roosevelt era. And if anything, we might categorize Donald Trump as speak loudly and carry a big stick. Because he certainly doesn't speak softly about things. He jumps in, shall we say, rather abruptly at times, and with some, I think, uncertainty for other countries as to where the United States is going. America First rang overseas with an alarm bell, of course, for allies, for NATO allies, and NATO had come in for a good bit of criticism in the campaign. I think Mr. Trump had followed the admonitions of now departed General Flynn, who early on enunciated some, early before the inauguration and then a little bit after while he lasted, had enunciated certain themes of distrust of things like NATO, distrust of multilateral approaches to the world, and we know that there was a lot of anti-free trade, anti-NAFTA. We're seeing it still. And this, by the way, is part of that shift from the previous administration. I'm going to tear up the stuff that the previous administration had done. It's not worthless. It's worthless, and it's gotten us into trouble. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, for instance, became an early casualty of the administration. And this kind of thinking about NATO being obsolete was some of the early day rhetoric. Now, interestingly, we're now told it's not obsolete anymore. So that's an interesting shift, and it makes you wonder, it makes other countries wonder exactly which of the words the new president utters and tweets are reliable, or are what he really thinks, or are sustainable in the administration. So there are some basic themes and directions we can detect, but there are also some deviations in the course and some, sort of lane changes, if we will, that we have to try to make sense out of here early on. Who knew Korea was going to be so complicated? I think the president sort of indicated, sort of echoing his statement about healthcare. So signs and signals are taken. Signs and signals, when you can't know for sure, when you're told stuff, maybe you look for signs and signals. And one of the disturbing signs, I think, that other countries have noted, and some Americans have noted, is the drastic cuts that appear to be in process of the State Department, the diplomatic arm of the United States. Now, for the president, I think it reflects a certain budgetary cutback in a number of places, which he refers to as, what do all these people do? Why do we need so many people? In the EPA or in the various regulatory agencies and so on. And partly that's a political statement of, less government, and we don't need that. And it plays to his constituencies and his congressional, audience. But it also reflects a certain business mentality that we can cut back on all this stuff. We can trim, and we can make ourselves meaner and leaner. And my son-in-law can do 12 jobs instead. So, I mean, we've seen some of that, at least theoretically, that you're going to cut back the State Department 30%, but my son-in-law is going to run peace in the Middle East and negotiate with China and, run a few domestic programs. And, it sort of is kind of, I did it in business, why can't I do it in government kind of approach to things that we're seeing. And we don't know where we're going to end up with that. But it's read overseas as part of this America First, pull back, if you will, but then again, involvement in certain ways. So what is it dealing with? Well, we in peace theory tend to look at two different approaches for how you generally approach peace in the world. And it depends on whether you sort of take a hardline approach toward making peace or a I don't know, the word that we sometimes use, liberalist approach to taking. I don't mean American liberals, I mean liberalist in the sense of international multilateralism. For a long time now, the United States has been a leader in the development of international institutions. And yes, they are often founded, this foreign policy that we pursue with international institution building is often founded in self-interest, not just altruistic necessarily. But it is sincere that the United States has been a leader in the formation of or institutions, and the leader in the formation of institutions, starting with the United Nations, actually starting with the League of Nations, going on through the United Nations, and then as well, multilateral approaches at regional security, the Organization of American States, OAS, and NATO. And then, of course, fostering other regional organizations in new places, the Africa Union, the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The Americans have been cheering for, the American leadership has been cheering for such associations and organizations through many presidencies, both Republican and Democrat. There's certainly a trend, a line of liberalism that runs through the Republican Party, having to do with the benefits of free trade, for instance, having to do with multilateral approaches to confront communism during the day of communism, having to do with a lot of institution building. On the Democratic Party side, it tends to be also environmental approaches. We saw the notable achievement of Barack Obama in fostering a 190-nation agreement on climate change. Now, it doesn't have many teeth to enforce the provisions, but it is a major step forward that 190 countries would have signed on to something to say, we will report every 4 years how we've done in reducing emissions of climate-threatening gases and emissions from our industries. We will report on that, and we will compare notes, and we'll be transparent. And we will work toward a 2040, 2050 timeline when we can stay below the danger points that we think are out there, as scientists say, about the tipping point of the Earth's environment. So that was a major accomplishment at great length done by Secretary Kerry. And I don't think there's much constituency for that in the new administration. In fact, every indicator points to a lack of constituency in the new administration for that, ranging from the environmental protection cutback, regulatory cutbacks. And it's hard for me to envision a U.S. Secretary of State under the Trump administration of fostering a 190-nation conference to deal with a global public policy crisis. Just doesn't seem to be in the cards. The preference of this administration now appears to be bilateralism. We will tear up the multilateral approaches. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a good example of this. It was a 12-nation agreement, not just with Asian nations, by the way, but with Latin coastal nations, including Mexico and Canada, not Latin, but coastal, to deal across the Pacific in a way to foster freer trade. Admittedly, in the Obama vision of this, it's not just peacemaking through interdependency. That is one of the premises of liberalism, that interdependency will create harmony and peacemaking. But it wasn't just that. I think Obama harbored the notion that he could offset China's power in Asia by having the United States' presence permanently ensconced in a Trans-Pacific agreement that would have binding impact. China was not to be a member of that. China has its own initiatives for trade relations and investment collaboration. So it was a competitive thing as well. The tilt toward Asia, or the Pacific pivot, as the Obama people mentioned it. Well, interestingly enough, the Mexicans agreed to concessions in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that are pretty much exactly the ones that President Trump seems to want them to agree to in a NAFTA reform. And I'm not sure he bothered to read far enough in the agreement to know that they had already made those concessions. And tearing it up, you know, okay, so now you're back to square one with Mexico and NAFTA and Canada as well now. And I think it's a one-on-one kind of preference that he has. We will negotiate, but we'll negotiate one-on-one with everybody, rather than taking a multilateralist approach to things. And these are the implication of that for peace issues. The other side of the liberalist approach to peace is the so-called realist approach to peace, which says peace comes through deterrence. Peace comes through strength. Peace comes through scaring other people into not messing with you, or even enforcing on them stuff that you want them to do and give way in doing. So peace comes through armament. Peace comes through building the best nuclear weapons, you know, in a sense. We've heard that. And being very forceful at the outset in negotiations with high demands and high profile rhetoric. The interesting thing is that that plays differently with different audiences overseas. There is, and I'm not sure how much the president is concerned about it, but there is the issue of culture in peacemaking. And for some countries, it's not the most productive thing to do to call them on the carpet and embarrass them publicly at the beginning and expect them to make concessions, culturally speaking. It may work. I don't know, you know, I'll talk a little bit about our relations with China in a couple of minutes, but that appears to be the motif of the Trump approach to China at the moment, which is, you know, call them on the carpet. Make sure they know Korea is up to them and they better do something or they're going to suffer consequences in some other area. And by the way, he links areas. He seems to link trade to security, which can be done, but it is a little controversial because there are separate domains of negotiation and agreement regarding economic and security matters. And sometimes people keep them separate. I'm reminded of the interesting point that all during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, and even today with the vicious sort of Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, guess who are cooperative together in the organization called OPEC? Iraq and Iran were, Saudi Arabia and Iran are. They compete in one area, but they keep that sort of separate from the other area of OPEC, where they have common interests and needs and collaborate. So this whole tradition of world politics is that you collaborate in some things and you contend on some things. I'm not sure how much that computes for the president, although I think he probably thinks that because relations with Russia are, in his thinking, I believe, both collaborative and competitive. Relations with China, he does recognize China's importance economically. He talks about it. Done deals there. There may be some properties that need attending to. But at any rate, he knows that those issues exist, but it's unexplored territory how much one set of pressures will diminish progress in another domain. So the deterrence approach to peace is, I think, the one that is preferred by the president in that regard, and it doesn't have, I don't think he has much time or care about the importance of collaborative or institution building, shall we say, which many in the Republican Party do appreciate. Now, one of the key institutions for peace in the world is under some threat these days. And it's one that has made a monumental difference in world politics and the prospect of war. And I think it's under duress, and for better or worse, our president seems to cheer on some of the anti-institutional sentiments about the European Union. I think it's remarkable that he didn't end up shaking the hand of Angela Merkel. And I'm not sure what she made of it, although she invited the presidential daughter to meet recently, so hopefully there's some fence mending if it's needed. But at any rate, he has had some sympathy for the Brexit people in England, the UK. And as well, he seems to harbor some admiration for Madame Le Pen in France. And ironically, who else harbors admiration for her? Somebody who had her visit, and that's Mr. Putin. I think Mr. Putin's game quite clearly is to diminish these institutions. These institutions that the American foreign policy has depended on for so many years to weaken as much as possible NATO's penetration of Eastern Europe, to weaken as much as possible the European Union's unity, and to support, sometimes even directly interfere to support leaders who will undermine that particular institution of the European Union. Even as he makes deals with the European Union, there are the gas and oil agreements that the Russians have. So it's not as if they want a total break, but they want to weaken and confuse and cause a little bit of conflict and havoc, perhaps, wherever they might, so they can do more for their own interests. And I think it goes back to this kind of admiration for these kind of strong type leaders that the president has shown. Congratulatory call to Mr. Erdogan in Turkey on the successful referendum that was held, which diminishes democratic control in the country and pretty much establishes strongman rule. We have had leaders before who have professed to admire strongmen. Henry Kissinger, as a matter of fact, said he was more at ease dealing with strong, authoritative leaders because their word was law. If they made a deal, if they made an agreement with you, you could rely on it rather than they got to go back to the parliament and get approval and all that kind of stuff. So we've seen some of this before, but generally from professional foreign policy elites who had one kind of approach. But from the President of the United States, it's been unusual to see kind of an admiration society for some of the more authoritarian rulers coming to power in the world. And it does remind you a little bit of America First in the 1930s in that respect. And one thing we want to note and watch for. So what about China? What about Iran? And what about these places that are, so controversial for us and so important for us? Well, the president now says about Iran that he recognizes that maybe the agreement that he called one of the worst of ever, is that what it was during the campaign, the worst ever, of the Obama nuclear agreement with Iran, maybe it's not so bad, but they're still testing missiles, and therefore they're still guilty of threats, and they're obstreperous, and they got to be reined in, or threatened in. I think this will have considerable weight, by the way, on the upcoming Iranian elections, which will be taking place soon for president, where you might see hardliners coming back to the fore. It's been a rather open presidency so far in the recent years that have made this deal with us in return for diminishing sanctions on Iran. As we know, President Trump had a lot of negative things to say about President Obama's diminishing of those sanctions. But we are selling Boeing planes in Iran now for the first time in years, so there are some tangible, clear results. At any rate, I think the president also may not be fully aware or care much about the fact that Iran, if you're interested in defeating ISIS, Iran is the main factor fighting ISIS in Iraq at the moment. Now, that crosses into Syria in a different context. In Syria, they are the main upholder of the Assad regime, them and the Russians. But in Iraq, without Iran and the militias that it has supported, ISIS would have already taken over the Iraqi government. They were on the outskirts of Baghdad before they were effectively confronted by the Shia militias and the Iranians. Now, you may have trouble, with some of that, implications for the future. What if Iran really extends its full controls into Iraq and Syria as well? And that scares a lot of people. That scares people the president listens to, right, ranging from the Israelis to the Saudis. But it's not to be ignored that you vilify a country that you're collaborating with in an important respect to try to contain the number one priority, which you say you've set, which is kick the hell out of ISIS. Is that what was the point of that? So some of the contradictions and some of the nuances, we don't know how strongly they're being entertained. The president relies a lot on the general staff, shall we say, on the generals. He had once indicated he was going to replace all of them, didn't he? I guess it wasn't feasible. So he has a lot of reliance on our generals who are great. And with the State Department cut at 30%, we are going to see, for better or worse, most of the probably foreign policy advice coming in from the Defense Department. Now, that's not all bad necessarily. The Defense Department isn't always anxious to fight wars and start conflicts where they are not necessary. They have a lot to lose. They're a lot at risk, ranging from equipment to personnel in willy-nilly flights into warfare. But at the same time, we have to be concerned that if you pre-authorize the military to do certain things, which the president has told us he is sort of done regarding Syria and other places. The military is pre-authorized to go ahead and do what they think they need to do. You are sort of abandoning civilian control and oversight. And sometimes the military, for inadvertent reasons, can make mistakes, or for other reasons can be a little overzealous. We're hearing a fair amount these days about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how the president may see, and some may see, the Korean situation as a kind of a reminiscent of the time America seemed to be very threatened by a potential nuclear power, a small nuclear state that is hostile to us. And the Russians, in the missile crisis, were very much put on notice that they are not to put missiles within 90 miles of the United States. What I'm not sure he understands, and most Americans may not, is that the Cuban Missile Crisis ended in a negotiated agreement. It did not end in simply a sort of a deterrent stand down where the Russians gave up and we brought them to their knees and they blinked. That's how it was that's how it looked, and indeed Khrushchev cooperated in letting it look that way, as we cooperated in making him look good as a peacemaker. But in the real negotiated final round, Cuba, the Russians withdrew the missile bases from Cuba, and the United States in turn promised not to invade Cuba again. How many Americans know that the United States has made a promise that continues to this very day not to invade Cuba? Well, I'm glad to hear it. This is an informed crowd. But Jimmy Carter didn't even seem to know it when he came to power and talked about a Russian brigade in Cuba, and we might have to do something about it. I think somebody then whispered in his ear, Mr. President, there's this agreement in the State Department files, which is good to have State Department files, that we promised. Because that was indeed the intent of the whole thing about getting missiles for Castro, was to keep the United States from invading again when a year before we had done the Bay of Pigs. Not direct invasion, but Contras invading Cuba. It was a fiasco. And that's why Kennedy was so reactive to what the Russians did. But it was a negotiated agreement. And negotiated agreements, the president tells us he's a great negotiator. So hopefully he's open to negotiated agreements, but I'm not sure how much history he reads. And I'm not sure that he knows the nuances of what's required very often, that it's not just big stick that makes the difference. It may be quiet diplomacy in the background as well. So if we look at his approach to China at the moment, it appears that he is trying to force China into putting the clamps on Kim Jong-un. Well, the United States has been negotiating in this regard for many years in a six-power set of talks with President Obama and President Bush and President Clinton, all having the same mentality that China is a key to hopefully controlling the Koreans, but we have to understand that China does not fully control North Korea. I mean, they could invade, I suppose, and take them over, maybe even jointly with us. We hear the term, what is it, decapitation being thrown around, something that we've practiced with terrorist organizations. Take out the leader. And we hear little mumblings about that potential with North Korea. What if we took them out? Would the Chinese come with us and take them out? And I think the administration the other day said, why would the Chinese object to a unified Korea? We will assure them it's not going to be any kind of threat. Well, in the process of being ousted, the North Korean regime, you can bet, will do its utmost to cause havoc before that happens. We heard Saddam Hussein talk about the mother of all battles. Turns out he wasn't able to do it finally in the end when he was invaded, when Iraq was invaded, and they had regime change. But Iraq did not have nuclear weapons. Despite what was said, Iraq did not have nuclear weapons. And the Koreans are attached to nuclear status. They may not even fully have it, but they want everybody to think they have it to the nth degree because it's their only hope of keep away from us. Stay away. No regime change here. This is a family thing. The North Koreans have a family dynasty. The Syrians have a family dynasty. The Saudis have a family dynasty. There's a family in Washington, isn't there? We won't go into that. Family dynasties are very power interested and very, very averse to losing it. And if President Trump reads about the Korean War, which I hope he may, I doubt that he may have in much detail, he'll know that the Chinese came into the Korean War when the United States got too close to China. And the United States under Truman and MacArthur had ignored direct warnings from China. Do not cross the Yalu River and get close to the border. You come north, you liberated South Korea, but you come north now and don't get too close. At that time, China did not have nuclear weapons. The United States had them. But that didn't stop Mao from intervening to protect what was seen as sacrosanct border issue, just as the United States went to the mat with the Russians about 90 miles away from Florida, getting too close. The United States has to be very careful about how it fashions its pressure on China, about Chinese determination of whether the United States will get too close with the South Koreans coming to the north, potentially. China doesn't like North Korea's regime. China doesn't trust North Korea's regime or having a nuclear North Korea, some kind of wild-eyed country on the border. But the alternative of the United States being based on the Korean Peninsula and coming to the border would be just as devastating for them now as it was in 1950. Maybe President Trump can negotiate understandings. Maybe he can make it clear to the Chinese, we'll pull out of there, don't worry about a thing. But the Chinese have offered a deal, which evidently has been rejected, that if the United States calls off its annual war games with South Korea, which is a moment, you can predict this, when the United States and South Korea have war exercises, North Korea will do some weird thing, some off-the-wall crazy thing, launch missiles, shoot artillery to make its point. So the Chinese are saying, call those off, and we'll put very strong pressure on North Korea to freeze their nuclear development, their military. So that was rejected out of hand by the Trump administration. First notice, we're told. But maybe they're coming back with something like that. So the question is, where are they? Are they shifting? Are they realizing the complexities? Are Are they going, maybe backtracking a little, or are they pursuing this kind of strong statement pressure on everybody that may or may not work? I see I'm getting a signal back here that you guys want to ask questions. So I need to let you do that, and I want to let you do that, so let's talk.
Great, thank you very much for being here. Awesome, I really enjoyed it. I want to take you to piece of paper, and I'm going to have you focus on the second quote while I refer to a couple of things you said. Some people believe that peace comes through strength and force, call them on the carpet, versus collaboration. And this thing you just recently said was China, North Korea versus Trump, maybe negotiate understanding. I thought that second quote is right on.
The second quote is, peace cannot be kept by force, it can only be achieved by understanding. And I agree with that. I think that understanding is the key to peacemaking. By the way, I didn't finish why the EU is such an effective peacemaker. We don't hear about war between France and Germany anymore. That was almost an impossible dream to think in 1914 and in 1940, 1940.
Who was the quote by?
And this is Albert Einstein in that quote, yes. Albert Einstein, who warned, by the way, about nuclear developments in Germany, and who doesn't think, as Freud did, that there's a death instinct that humans have. Freud thought there was a death instinct and humans are doomed to be violent with each other, unfortunately. In letters with Einstein, Einstein said that's crazy. There is no such instinct. It can be understanding. It can be negotiated. It can be understood. And the EU has cleverly merged these economies. For better or worse, it's not without problems. It's got severe problems in financing particularly. But it's overcome all of these differences, and it's created norms of expected behavior. If you want to get in the EU, you got to quit having political prisoners. You got to get rid of dictatorship. You've got to improve your behavior. Now that's on the liberalist side of peacemaking, and it was effective there. It's not effective everywhere in the same regard. Where poverty prevails or where corruption prevails, it's much more difficult. And you may need a bigger stick to try to deal with corrupt leaders. But I think that this is certainly, indicative of the Einstein approach to peacemaking, and I think it's valid. Yes?
Regarding ideologies, that leaders develop, in particular Putin, it's said that he is having monuments built and also having his inner circle read books by a not very well-known Russian fascist, Ivan Ilyin. And this is a name that isn't out there much in the news or the public. Is there anything you can say to the effect of, what Ilyin spoke of about undermining Western democracy?
Is it Ivan Illich that you're talking about? Is it?
No.
Ilyin.
Ivan Ilyin, I-L-Y-I-N.
I'm not fully familiar with all of his writings, but I know that the Putin regime has been in bed with a number of...
He's long gone. He died in the 1950s.
Right.
But he had written on ways that we can kind of see Putin, applying in terms of his, if you will, kind of under the radar, trying to subvert elections here, France, what have you. And maybe you can just speak to the...
Well, Putin is a right-wing, I would have to say, nationalist. And his reactions have been to restore Russia to greatness. Excuse me. Make Russia great again. In a sense that Russia had been humiliated. The Soviet Union had fallen, and people were selling their clothes on the streets. I saw it. My wife and I saw it. People were laying in the street waiting for ambulances, which didn't come. The life expectancy had gone from 75 to 55 because of the total disruption of the health system. Russia was humiliated. They had been in space. They were a superpower in their own thinking. And by the way, we still depend on them in space to effectively reach the space station, although I guess a private company is stepping in. And then NATO had pulled up on their doorstep, extending further to the east, taking new countries. And the EU had outreached to new members and made little deals with, proposed deals with the Ukraine. So Russia could be predicted under Putin, and the people like it, to be restored to greatness. And the most clear demonstration of it is taking back Crimea. And I don't hear much objection to it as a legal issue from our government now. That was a illegal move. Illegal because it violated an agreement that they had made with the Ukraine to get nuclear weapons returned from Ukraine to Russia, and an agreement was made to respect Ukrainian sovereignty. They tore that up. Yes, there's an imperative historically for the Russians to control that part of the Black Sea and to have that naval access at Sevastopol and so on. But it could be a negotiated agreement. It didn't have to be march in and foment a referendum among, yes, an admittedly pro-Russian element of population that lives in Crimea. So it was an illegal move. Standing up for international law is a key attribute of peacemaking, because it's one of the building blocks that we use to promote what we call global order, world order. Yes, it's violated. Yes, it's ignored at times. But the establishment of rules that you set behavioral expectations, it's like that global warming treaty. People are now on record as committed, for better or worse, to do something about it. It's a first step. One of my colleagues in social science, Steven Pinker, has written, you won't believe it, but humans are actually less violent now than they were 1,000 years ago. By his historical, archaeological research, we don't do human sacrifices anymore. We still do human trafficking. We're still bad dudes. Sometimes we're bad hombres. But there are certain things we've stopped doing, more or less. And Pinker attributes this to governing, to government, institutions, rules, expectations, and norms. Little by little, it's wrong to victimize women. It still happens. In terrible ways, it still happens, but more and more it's recognized globally that it's wrong. And the more you can do that in that perspective of peacemaking, the more you can do that, the more steps we take toward improved human relations. Yeah.
Taking into consideration all the things regarding the situation with North Korea and our perception of what's happening between China. If you were living in Hawaii right now, might you consider...
You mean that little island in the Pacific?
Might you consider moving to Michigan?
Well, the North Koreans, when they threatened the United States in the first place 2 years ago, had the most atrocious, crazy map of the U.S. They didn't seem to know where Louisiana was. They seemed to think it was in Oklahoma or someplace. So we can only hope that they would be confused as to any of the geography. I would be concerned. It's a matter of concern if a hostile state recklessly gains access to such weapons. But as you know, recklessness can be in two sides. And when you send an armada to their coastline, which happens to end up in Australia, but you send an armada of 7 ships to their coastline without knowing what's going to be the response of anybody. I think we probably feel North Korea is overstated, that they don't really have the capabilities they seem to flaunt at us. You know, some of the missiles in the parade may be empty, actually, or fake. We don't know for sure, but they have a lot of artillery which can unload on Seoul, a city of over 12 million lying within 30 miles of their territory. Whatever we do to them, they can cause tremendous havoc to one of our key allies, actually to 2 of our key allies, Japan being the other, and Tokyo. So that's why we haven't regime changed them already, frankly, like we did with Saddam Hussein. That and untold consequences that come from regime changing. Look at the mess of Iraq. Look at the mess of Libya. President Obama inherited that mess, or made it himself, I mean, stepped into it in Libya. And how ironic it is, you know, his predecessor had done it in Iraq, he did it in Libya, and both came a cropper in various painful ways. And they paid a lot of attention to what they were doing, it appears. But they didn't have the whole story. They didn't have the whole story of the unintended consequences. They didn't think maybe that far ahead. I hope we have some serious thinkers about this. And interestingly about peacemaking, I was going to mention, the Palestinian-Israeli situation is going to come up at some point, probably during this administration, and it seems to have been turned over to Jared Kushner. But we have to remember something. The Saudis, I would think, want this deal. The Saudis want the Israelis to make and finalize a real agreement with the Palestinians, because Saudi Arabia is ready to recognize Israel. How do I know that? Well, they as much as admitted that if the Palestinian deal was made, there would be a clear way to do it. And who's their common enemy, quote unquote? They're both concerned about Iran, for better or worse. And I think they both have the ear of the administration, for better or worse. Because the Saudis have done some very reckless and I think destructive things in Yemen with Obama and with Trump. And we've done a few as well. By the way, that violates American law. The use of American weapons on civilians is not allowed under the Foreign Arms Export Control Law, but the U.S. administration has generally turned a blind eye when allies or colleague states do it for anti-terrorist reasons, quote unquote. So there's a lot of mending that needs to happen, but with the Saudis and the Israelis potentially both gaining from such an agreement, you may see some progress. Not necessarily for the right reasons, but you may see some progress on the Palestinian front. And I believe the administration is welcoming Mr. Abbas to talks. So who knows? There are a lot of ironies that can occur, you know, with peacemaking. The most unusual peacemakers, the Nixons and the Maos. There's an opera about it, if you don't believe me. So maybe there could be an opera someday about Trump and Kim Jong-un. I hesitate to even think of it. But anyway, that's something you have to watch for in world affairs, yes.
And that would be last question.
Oh, well, I know Roger had a question too. Are we going to let Roger do one?
The other day, Trump had a meeting of 100 senators in the White House for whatever reason, and I believe they were, as I understand, they were discussing North Korea, and I heard that they're discussing possible additional sanctions, and I'm wondering what additional sanctions are there available? I don't know what ones specifically there are right now, so I'm sure it's basically no trade, no whatever. But what additional sanctions?
I think it's to cut the...
We do it before.
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I think it's to try to cut North Korea off from all dollar dealings, and maybe China as well. I mean, you know, what's he going to do to China if they don't deliver North Korea? Well, you know, you have this. It's a very important relationship with China, both ways, and you don't take it lightly. But I think that they would. They talked about putting additional travel and other restrictions on certain North Korean elites who aren't already restricted. There are many restrictions already. And really trying to strangle them economically as much as possible. But China is very concerned, you know, about refugees from a desperate regime, already a regime in some poverty. If you look at the lack of electricity that, you know, is so conspicuous at night. China provides 50% of the food and 90% of what else? Something else that they depend on. What is it? Yeah, 90% of the energy, I believe, and 50% of the food. So from just a statistical standpoint, this is really trying to put pressure on China to do more sanctioning. You never know where Kim Jong-un will come down on that. Maybe he sees some light. We hear that his father was more tuned into world realities than he may be, longer experience. Trying to make him wake up to that fact is probably worthwhile. He's not irrational, completely irrational. He does what he does for a purpose, to try to keep us away as much as possible. But if some sort of arrangement could be worked out that the U.S. backed off, I think what they'd like to do is create a unified Korea and then back off. Eliminate Kim Jong-un and then back off. Whether China would stand for that or risk it, I'm not sure, because on the way out, as I say, that regime will do massive things, I think. Will not go easily into the night.
Okay, you can do one quick question.
Well, it's not a quick one. I was going to have you tell us a little bit about responsibility to protect and how it was used in Libya, and whether that's peacemaking or peacekeeping.
Well, it's a good question. One of the evolving norms, we talk about norms in the world, there's the norm of sovereignty, which is evoked by the Russians, particularly when they talk about Syria. Leave Syria alone. We do not oppose the government. If anything, help the government. The government has the right to rule and crack down on rebellion. The Russians say that, and then, of course, they go and back rebels who want to overthrow the Ukraine government. So it depends on where they're talking about. But, so there's the sovereignty principle, which is a long-standing one in world affairs, which keeps peace, because it comes out of the peace of 1648, as a matter of fact, of the 30-Year War, which was European princes, Catholic versus Protestant. Other religions do fight each other. Catholic versus Protestant agreed after 30 years of fruitless, bloody warfare to just leave each other alone. They didn't leave each other alone, but they agreed to leave each other alone, and therefore stop fighting. So peacemaking on that front can be, sovereignty. On the other side, though, we've witnessed in the 20th century a mounting crescendo of human atrocities, coming from the days of the Armenian genocide, through the Holocaust, to Rwanda and Bosnia, a gradual buildup of the notion that you just can't sit by and watch governments decimate their people. You've got to do something. That's what we call the responsibility to protect. But that doesn't say you have to do it militarily, necessarily. You can do it by accepting refugees. Really? You can do it by accepting refugees in large numbers from desperate people. You can do it by flying in humanitarian relief supplies. You can do it by, you can do it by military rescue. Yes, you can do that too. So the UN has two competing principles going. And some of the action of the UN has been to enforce one or the other. There's a lot that has sovereignty. The Security Council, the Russians and the Chinese veto stuff, and the Americans veto things that are too intrusive to their interests. On the other hand, the Americans have backed the idea that you're supposed to do something. Now, you ask about Libya, I think the Obama administration got a little carried away with the notion of getting on the right side of history, as Hillary Clinton put it, and getting rid of all these old, hard, encrusted dictators who are so unpopular in the Middle East. Let's get rid of them. And before Gaddafi even could have a chance to attack his own rebels, we started flying missions and having the British and French do it to restrict him, but that got a little carried away. It didn't just restrict him, it killed him. And the whole thing blew up in militias that we hadn't accounted for, and the penetration of Al-Qaeda groups that we hadn't accounted for. The CIA, I think, had fallen down a little bit on the mission of knowing who's who and what's what and what's going to happen if you do something like that. So there is a responsibility to protect, but you got to do it judiciously and not when there's nothing happening yet, necessarily, but do it in such a way that you can make some difference. And in Syria, of course, it's blocked. It was blocked by vetoes in the attempt to do, the hope of doing something about that. And then the embarrassment of the chemical weapons issues. And Mr. Trump did rise to the occasion of doing something about a supposed chemical release, but still there's no certainty who did it. But in his mind, he knew, and he made a statement by launching missiles. I think the administration makes statements by military spasm, shall we say. His tendency is to do some military thing, whether or not it's connected to an overall strategy or not. Just a military thing, like dropping the mother of all bombs. Well, okay, it may have had some strategic impact, but what's the follow-up? Is it meant to just scare people? Is it meant to send a message to North Korea, this could happen to you too? We're not sure what the messages are that are being sent, and whether they're well conceived and well fully thought out. But there does seem to be this tendency to want to do something spectacular that'll get on CNN and go global. So we watch for that for the next 100 days. Hopefully we have it.
Dr. Pearson, you certainly show how complicated a piece it is. So we thank
Who
you.
knew?
Right.
Who knew?
No, and very comprehensive tonight. Thank you so much. For those of you who want more, Kathy Dopp, drinks discussion at the Cascade Roadhouse. Always a good time, lots of fun conversations. So head on over there after the program and continue the conversation. And also, if you're interested in learning more about the World Affairs Council, please do check out our table on your way out the door. But thank you so much for coming, for finishing up this series, and we hope to see you again at other events that we have with the World Affairs Council.